tried to present a research project which was funded by a British Academy small grant, which explored forms of racism denial on the Twitter social media platform. If any of you got a grant from the British Academy of Small Grants, only £10,000. I think we utilised it quite well because it was a collaborative project. So I worked with Phil Brooker, who used to be at Bruno but now is at Bath. And he was based in computer science because partly we gathered quite a lot of data from the Twitter platform, so it needed a kind of computational methodology to explore it. Okay, abuse and threats, especially to forms of racism, misogyny and homophobia, seem to be regular occurrences on social media. It's difficult to know whether social media is actually responsible for increasing forms of hate, or if it just reflects the fact that more people are online, and this is an ongoing issue to explore. In particular, the microblogging site of Twitter is often singled out as a popular medium for trolling and hate. And in fact, studies of social media appear to confirm that there seems to be a problem of online hate with Twitter. One recent study looked at kind of discourses around football, and they found that 88% of discriminatory messages were on Twitter compared to, say, Facebook, which was something like 8% and other platforms. So there must be something idiosyncratic about Twitter. And Demos did quite a large study, and they estimated something like there's 17,000 tweets per day which contain racist or ethnic slurs in English. And if you follow the media around social media, there have been some significantly high-profile cases around Twitter misogyny and racism. For example, the journalist Caroline Credo Perez was brutally targeted on Twitter, including threats of gang rape during a campaign to increase the representation of women on British banknotes. And similarly, the footballer Fabrice Muamba received cruel racist abuse on Twitter after collapsing on a pitch with a suspected heart attack. And it's not surprising commentators such as The Nation's Cather Pollock sent a tweet out such as saying, "Twitter is a poisonous well of bad faith and viciousness." Now these accounts and more general media reporting, they buttress assumptions that Twitter has become a conduit for circulating the loathsome sentiments of pathological users, or worse, the technological affordances of the media itself are responsible for proliferating and intensifying kind of crowdsourced hate and racism. Now probably the most convincing example of this kind of thinking is what has been labelled as the greater internet fuckwood theory. I always wanted to say that in a room. I don't know if any of you have come across this. Essentially, it was about gaming and the kind of abuse in gaming, but it became quite famous, and Onion did a kind of spoof of it as well. So essentially, because of the apparent affordances of the web, such as anonymity, the greater social connectivity we have, a potential audience, so us ordinary folks, we're kind of unable to resist indulging in the kind of online racism. Now there's sort of at least two problems with these kinds of accounts. First is a kind of technological determinism operating, and that actually makes it difficult to acknowledge how the affordances of social media platforms can play a more complex role in propagating certain forms of racism, something I want to argue today. And secondly, these accounts fail to advance an understanding of what online racism is. As Lisa Nakamura, who's a very significant writer in this field, she says the assumption is, with the gift theory, that it's not the actor, it's the network. More broadly, this lack of understanding of online racism isn't specific to gift-type thinking. And as discussed in much of the literature, there's this kind of general difficulty of identifying the specificities of online racism. So there's terms such as trolling, flaming, cyberbullying. They've all got various meanings and uses and can refer to specific kinds of groupings, activities and online spaces. So it's very unsettled still. What are we talking about? And furthermore, accounts of online racism tend to focus on the visible, more extreme forms. And this is an area I really want to sort of look at. So a racist incident can become viral and explode on social media because of its increased visibility across other platforms and other media sites. So for example, manifestations of Twitter racism can take the form of a set of users ferociously targeting a black or minority public figure, or on the other hand, the public shaming of an individual or media personality who said something racist intentionally or not. But that also continues to circulate the original racist incident. So there's this almost a kind of parasitic relationship between the racist event and its circulation and promotion on media platforms. Here I'm talking about social media and more traditional forms. And the work of Whitney Phillips on trolling is exemplary here if you want to sort of look at that relationship more. Now, in these accounts, racism is represented as a series of seemingly spontaneous, capricious events. Racism is characterized as sensational and exceptional, or kind of socially aberrant event. However, simultaneously, racism is rendered mundane politically because it's devoid of any critical understanding, and it's reduced to a kind of online set of news values, which either blame pathological individuals or the medium itself. And these accounts of racism not only obfuscate its kind of historical and systemic nature, but also obscures the presence of everyday modalities of online racism. And arguably, everyday online racism is prolific on social media, yet we know little about its operations. There's also a limit of most academic research examining online racism. It doesn't look at the everyday, partly because it's actually hard to. Of course, there's good reason why we should focus on extreme forms of racism, that seems to cause the most damage. Nevertheless, but keeping our focus on the highly visible forms could miss out on grasping the significance of the everyday and how it's experienced. And everyday racism still remains relatively invisible to research. So the project I've been involved in, we attempted to capture a certain kind of everyday racism by exploring the use of the Twitter hashtag not racist, as a mode of racism denial. And there's two specific aspects I want to explore today with you. First, I attempt to theorize the ambient nature of online racial discourse and how specific hashtagging practices can circulate certain kinds of racism denial talk. We also explored Twitter's platform's technological affordances by actually focusing on hashtags as propagators of racialized talk. So hashtags aren't just linguistic signs, they actually have a certain kind of affordance on Twitter platform and elsewhere. And in this respect, online platforms such as Twitter can be conceived as assemblages for understanding the constitutive relationships between media users, racism and digital technology. And in relation to hashtags, social researchers need to be careful not to simply consider them only in terms of as a linguistic sign. What's of interest in our study is how the technocultural affordances of Twitter are generative of race talk in relation to the use of racialized hashtags. So conceiving race as a digital assemblage identifies the emergence of racialization in online spaces by exploring how it works and what relations it generates, rather than just focusing on its representation and meaning. So most of the work on racism tends to focus on representation and meanings as opposed to the actual constitutive relations of how race emerges. So specific forms of racism denial can be grasped in terms of how it's formed in relation to a Twitter assemblage. And that can be constituted by the informational logics of hashtags, user behavior, software interfaces and algorithms, such as the trending algorithm, and network relations, as well as meaning and effects. So it's trying to hold all those things together. Now, researching the everyday rather than highly visible racism in social media is actually methodologically challenging, not only because of contested definitions of what constitutes racist talk, but also how to identify this on Twitter. Now, our method, it's not an infrequent method when you research Twitter to look at hashtags, because already you form a massive data reduction. On Twitter, currently there's something like 500 million tweets a day, and most researchers can't access that. It's called the fire hose. You have to have enormous amounts of money to actually get hold of that. And even if you get hold of the fire hose, what are you going to do with so many tweets? You have to have quite a significant computational infrastructure to make sense of it, to pass that kind of data. So what us poor researchers do is use the Twitter API, which is what you do when you do a search, and just pull data from that. Depending on what kind of search terms you're using, you might miss out a lot of data, or you might capture most of the data set. In our case, we think we captured most of it because not racist isn't a frequently used term and interesting in itself. And we actually experimented with different kinds of terms, but we settled on not racist. I can talk about that more if you want me to. We collected tweets with the not racist hashtag over approximately an 8-month period. That's kind of arbitrary. The project was funded for a year, so we sort of settled on that. And we collected something like almost 25,000 tweets. You can kind of call that small big data, if there is such a term. Big enough to sort of not just simply having to plough through looking at 25,000 tweets to try and make sense of it. The approach we used was a visual analytic one, using a software suite called Chorus. This has been developed by people in computer science in my university in Brunel. It's actually freely available software you can download. It only, unfortunately, just runs on Windows platform. Okay, let's have a look at some examples of some of the kinds of tweets we collected. You can kind of see they're quite complex in what they're sort of articulating. Some are more obvious than others. I mean, for example, my cat doesn't like watermelon. Maybe in American context we'd think that more, but even in itself, the fact that someone puts not racist on it kind of implies it's racist. So you can see to drill down, you have to have some sort of qualitative method, but we tried to sort of use more of a visual analytical method because we wanted to keep that kind of the significance of the data set. It's useful at this stage just to briefly talk about racism denial, and so we can start making sense of this hashtag not racist. Now, direct and explicit racist talk is less publicly and morally acceptable due to stronger anti-discriminatory social norms these days. That's across many Western nations. Critical race scholars such as Eduardo Bonilla Silva maintain that the apparent decline in publicly offline overt racist discourse has been substituted with subtler, more coded racialized expression. So it's resulted in more strategic forms of public race talk, particularly in relation to practices of the denial of prejudice, so the phrase, I'm not racist. Now, in relation to Twitter, the inclusion of the hashtag not racist echoes this strategy of denial. In fact, one of the arguments in the kind of bigger paper is that not racist entangles privatized expressions of racism with public modes of denial. So some people, I think Joe Fagan has done some work around the kind of using Gotham in the front stage and backstage, what people say in private spaces as opposed to public spaces. Interesting about Twitter is it blurs the public and private in a very complicated way that still people are trying to figure out. Okay, so the first sort of wave of analysis we attempted. Apologies for the slightly blurry graphic. Now what you see is a timeline representation of the not racist data set over the 8-month period. So this represents the kind of the 25,000 tweets over the 8 months. Now Chorus software displays various metrics such as tweet frequency, which are the grey block, and other metrics such as links and topical novelty, which I won't go into. But essentially what we can just read off this visualization is that we captured a relatively low volume of tweeting activity across a wide array of racialized messages. So there's all sorts of, as you saw, all sorts of different kinds of topics. There didn't seem to be anything really in common. These messages kind of just bubble away in the background of Twitter without ever trending or really becoming visible. And interestingly, the not racist hashtag doesn't seem to be about any specific event or conversational topic. They're not sharing it in the conventional way as joining in a discussion. They're just kind of tweeting away. So already it's kind of thinking, well, are these just kind of isolated tweets which don't, and that's the end of the kind of the analysis, we stop there. Was there something else going on? So one way to think about this is using the idea of the long tail that people come across. It pops up everywhere. It's kind of power law of distribution, particularly on the net and the web. So rather than focusing on the popular and most active tweeting, which is kind of what we see as becoming visible, imagine the Twitter stream, only very small number of tweets are retweeted, become and explode on Twitter that we know about. Most of tweets just disappear into the ether. So rather than focusing on something popular and kind of active tweeting or retweeting, which would then indicate some kind of controversial visible event, instead the not racist hashtag enables to explore what I would call the long tail racism of Twitter, the everyday racialized background chatter of social media. Now the racism of the long tail can be replete with forms of microaggression which are present but quite difficult to identify. And this long tail is produced by network effects, type of power law, which interestingly actually tends to be ignored by the majority of social media studies because it's sort of treated as noise. And paradoxically, you could say that most media users, including those on Twitter, spend most of the time residing in the banality of the long tail. Depending on how many followers you've got on Twitter, we can sort of decide where you are along that long tail. Now, in relation to the long tail, we could say that many of the tweets with the not racist hashtag operate as a mode of ambient racism. This is something I'm still kind of working on, so welcome your feedback. The notion of ambient, it's got some sort of musical registers as well, so it's not surprised that Brian Eno has written about the ambient in a quite neat way, as an atmosphere, kind of surrounding influence, which isn't kind of necessarily determinate, but it's just kind of there. And so the kind of apparently inconsequential events in the long tail, they can have a greater accumulative effect. And the second quote by Thompson, I think, captures this, where he talks about these tiny little updates, these individual messages, but what happens when they kind of form together in this kind of ambient way. So if you just go quickly back to the idea of the long tail, we could think about larger significant events, and we could think about minor, smaller events. And that's the kind of thing I've been thinking about in terms of what we'd call ambient racism. But to understand this more in relation to the hashtag, just have a quick little detour to what hashtags are, or how we can understand them. There's at least 4 ways. They're being searchable, where we can increase findability and visibility. They can form ad hoc groupings, could be part of a conversation, they can share content. They could be used as a statement in itself, so they punctuate a tweet. And they also could be a part of what's called ambient affiliation, and that's what I just want to briefly focus on. And Michelle Zappa-Vigna highlights that hashtags can function via ambient affiliation, so users are potentially present within a social network, but not necessarily directly connected together. And what can be invoked is an imagined audience of other users who may feel the same way, though they haven't directly interacted. And it could be argued that the not racist hashtag ambiently modulates a type of Twitter race talk. That's kind of one of the underlying arguments of the project. Now, our data wasn't time dependent, and methodologically this required a different analytical approach than the kind of event-based studies which dominate Twitter literature. Now, a non-time dependent analysis led to exploring the semantic structure of tweets using what's called a cluster explorer feature of the Chorus software, which was also used to generate the timeline. And this approach identifies topical clusters, that is meaning terms which frequently appear together in the tweet, terms, words, hashtags which appear together. And this relies on a co-occurrence algorithm which visually plots the relationship between the closest of terms. The closer together they are, the more bunched it will be. In our case, we actually observed multiple hashtags in tweets. Yeah? So along with not racist, we found other hashtags. This was something like 30 to 40% of our data set. And in general, Twitter has something like 15 or less than 15% of tweets have hashtags, which kind of is counterintuitive, but that's true. Well, in terms of it's been estimated as such. So our project has shifted towards looking at hashtags, but more than one hashtag, and how they're used alongside not racist. And these are some examples again of multiple hashtags. So along with not racist, you've got the hashtag just saying, which is quite a common one. And in the second example, you can see 5 hashtags and a link. And that wasn't uncommon in our data set. So something interesting was going on in terms of how people were performing racial denial on Twitter. Okay, so when we started plotting, so this visualization represents a cluster map of some of the most frequent hashtags that co-occur with not racist. So not racist, we don't put not racist on this visualization, we're just showing the other hashtags which frequently co-occurred with it. And we can kind of actually identify a pattern. There's actually all those, it's not very clear this, but all the little nodes, all our terms, and this is just been stripped out because we wouldn't be able to read it otherwise, so we just put the most common ones in. But we can actually observe a kind of inner radio which had common hashtags such as funny and laugh out loud, LOL. And there were tweets which contained jokes or comedic material. So, you know, I'm not racist because I'm just being funny. It's that kind of defense of racism. And slightly pushed out is a second radio we could kind of categorize, which we labeled as truth type hashtags, such as just saying, I swear. And these clarify or justify tweets by just saying, oh, this is what I saw, it's a fact. So it's another hashtag added onto not racist. So already we're seeing some different hashtagging practices emerge. Now, if we do go to the content of the tweet, we find, interestingly, that we get similar terms. The most popular terms used in both, if we categorize them as humour or truth, both black people, white, alike, were constantly being used in these data sets, in these categories. So it sort of implies that we can't semantically always distinguish between is something humorous or is something truth-based, even if the different hashtags are being used. So, some example, like here's a kind of a similar kind of tweet, but it's only because of the secondary hashtags can we decide whether it belongs into, seen as a kind of comedic defense or observational defense. Without the extra hashtags, we wouldn't be able to make that kind of interpretation. So what I'm kind of saying is, if we just do a kind of meaning-based analysis, not thinking about how hashtags are working, it kind of limits our analysis. So if you go to the visualization again, there's something significant about how humor hashtags cluster together, and there's lots more in that, where truth-based hashtags are slightly more pushed out. And here's another way of thinking about this. So for tweets categorized by humor hashtags, there's certain characteristics which were noticeable. Humor tweets often had many hashtags alongside not racist. So people were multiply hashtagging. So, and some hashtags were frequently used together. So there's actually a co-occurrence within hashtags. So tags such as funny and laugh out loud often were seen together. So even that had a co-occurrence in itself. But what we've also found that there's a relatively small pool of hashtags being drawn upon for those users who used humor-based hashtagging. Yeah. So they weren't having lots and lots of different hashtags. They were just selecting the sort of common set that people were drawing from. And it also appeared that these types of tweets, they often shared an internet object of some kind, whether it's a link to a Vine video, an Instagram post. So it's trying to maximize the visibility of a link by multiply hashtagging. The juxtaposition of these humor hashtags alongside not racist can mutate both sets of hashtags. So humor hashtags become racially charged, and the not racist hashtag acquires greater affiliative characteristic to construct this kind of imagined audience. Now, humor as a type of racialized talk seems to rely on a kind of a priori set of hashtags which users draw upon in order to situate their tweets as embodying racialized humor. And this practice of humor-based multi-hashtagging doesn't seek to explain the meaning of the tweet, because there are many hashtags deployed as kind of dense self-referential metadata. They actually are the tweet. So the invoked imagined audience shares the joke and ambiently participates in an online racialized culture that breaches social norms and propagates the kind of a cacophony of racialized effect. Now, in comparison, the truth subset of data we discover has a tendency to use multi-hashtags much less often. Often you get not racist and just one more hashtag. Though that one more hashtag, that secondary hashtag, was selected from a much broader pool of hashtags. And they all were trying to qualify or defend the tweet. Now here the use of hashtag indicates that the tweeter intends to sort of interpret their stance as justifying an apparent disaffiliation with racism. Now, unlike the small set of hashtags which are frequently used in humour tweets, truth tweets rely on a broad range of multi-hashtags, and they do not co-occur with each other, so we don't find them being used in the same tweet. And each tag is used relatively few times. So that gives the truth hashtag that kind of push, that's why it's pushed outwards. So part of our methodology was looking at visualizations and trying to make sense of them. If you work in this area, there's a kind of, almost a kind of visual porn emerging, where people fetishize the visualization and don't really know how to make sense of it. And one of the things we tried to do was to try to make sense of it. Okay, now it's fruitful to ask why truth as a mode of online racialized talk of denial relies on a diverse array of largely single-use hashtags in comparison to humour, which draws on a relatively narrow set of hashtags that are used multiple times. Now, the shared culture of online humour suggests that the circulation of racist text doesn't depend on an explicit justification, because for the user, the imagined audience can be a real one that shares a joke. It's a bit like, I know it's funny, we all know it's funny, I don't need to justify it's funny, apart from just saying it's funny. But in contrast, truth-based statements include hashtags that attempt to make explicit the kind of semantic intention. These hashtags are largely devoid of a shared online culture, apart from maybe the hashtag just saying, just got kind of more ambiguous sense. So the strategy of intensifying a user's stance by adding another truth-type hashtag, it seeks to contain the ambiguity of racialized meaning and legitimize the possible breaching of the backstage of privatized racism. Yet indicated by the creation of many singular truth-type hashtags, this practice is actually quite a fraught activity. It doesn't always work. So the proliferation of different truth-based justificatory hashtags is symptomatic of the kind of dissonant registers of how race denial is mobilized in everyday online discourse, in which the imagined audience is in the final instance actually lies and remains unknown for the people who tweet in this way compared to the people who tweet using humour. Okay, to conclude, conceiving an ambient racism in Twitter reveals how the not racist hashtag operates. It kind of creates a race talk by materialising seemingly diverse practices of denying racist expression. So the master hashtag, not racist, it racially charges other hashtags by activating different racial modalities of racialization. So in this respect, race is not simply inscribed in Twitter messages, nor can it readily decode their meanings. Rather, racialized expression is a reactive force that can emerge in the Twitter assembly through hashtag practices. And this approach complicates the relationship between visible, explosive forms of racism and the more invisible, everyday manifestation. And it's when we explore Twitter and other social media platforms from this kind of social materialist methodology, are we able to grasp the kind of generative complexities of online racism.
Very much. In what ways kind of conventions from other media forms might influence the way in which people use hashtags?
Yeah, I think it's certainly one way to think through where do hashtags emerge. I mean, one of the interesting things about hashtags is the kind of folksomony. You know, people generate hashtags. Twitter doesn't. We do.
Yeah.
So they come from somewhere. And to think about the kind of socio-technical way, they're born. There's lots of hashtags we produced all the time, and some of them picked up and then circulated and become significant for various times. I think with humour, pre-social media platforms, you know, love of cats and all the other kind of things that are humorous on the internet, there's been a humour-based online culture for a long, long time, almost since the birth of the web as such, or the internet even itself. So the sharing, I think, is more complex, it's more historical. How that then maps onto how then people invent and create hashtags, and we kind of knowingly know which hashtags to use compared to others, compared to, say, if we're trying to justify our racism through observational. I haven't got a straight answer for it, but I think it's the way to think through it. We have to sort of open it up to what kind of online cultures are they. And particularly the trolling cultures of Anonymous and the kind of B-board of 4chan, etc. Humour was always played a significant way of transgressing social norms. So that's my kind of short answer. It doesn't really answer the question, but there's a lot there that we need to think about more.
I think when you were talking about how the not racist hashtag is kind of assembled with other hashtags alongside it, and it's creating deterritorializations, you were kind of focusing on the idea of how they're re-territorializing or shoring up the not racist hashtag. So I was wondering, were there any deterritorializations that were used by other individuals or alongside that kind of destabilized the not racist hashtag into a more overt sense of racism where it was challenged?
Yeah, interesting question. Obviously in the data set there were lots of, our data set only consisted of tweets with not racist hashtags. We also did a concurrent harvesting of Twitter, looking at different phrases of "I'm not racist," which was actually a much larger data set, much more difficult to interpret. And we'd have to then go into some kind of semantic meaning based, and we just didn't have the resources in the time frame to do that. So we settled on hashtag, not kind of accidentally, but partly in terms of what's possible, and also to think through the platform itself and what's kind of significant on the platform, and almost everyone in experience, even though hashtags aren't only 50% of tweets less, but everyone's familiar with what hashtags do. So, but to think them beyond the idea of their meaning. So that was the way in. How that hashtag can get unsettled is, I don't know, to be honest. We didn't really look into that, and I think I'm not quite sure how we would, as opposed to maybe thinking about other. We looked at the most frequent types of hashtags, so we found observational and humour-based, but there were other ones, but they were less significant. We'd have to have a larger data set even to start thinking about how they work. But it does go back to the kind of the very idea of being not racist, whether you're knowingly racist or you're generally not racist, is very unsettled itself. So you could argue that the hashtag itself isn't settled, and these other hashtags are trying to do something with it. So that's one way. At least that partially answers your question.
I suppose I was wondering whether you see a kind of, how you would see the division of public and private, or divisions, if there's kind of multiple ways of understanding it in relationship to racism on Twitter that you're finding, and whether this alters your own sense of how racism's operating in relationship to divisions of public and private, and where people will and won't say certain things.
I mean, just to sort of start off, Twitter's a funny medium, because the norms of what people say and don't say on Twitter, it's surprising, isn't it, that people say the stuff they do say on Twitter. So the breaching of public and private is already occurring. I mean, it occurs in other social media platforms, but Twitter seems to be peculiar because it's got this speed of real-time messaging, but you can potentially go to a very large audience very quickly if your tweet becomes viral. So there's so many cases of semi-public figures saying something, and then it just being picked up and exploding. So, I mean, that's one axis of the public and private, how a tweet can go out to a certain set of users, followers, but then how that then jumps into scale, and it scales up to something incredibly huge when it's picked up by mainstream media. And I think I'm still thinking through the idea of what the public and private is in relation to that long tail. I think that long tail is really interesting, because the implication is it will never become really public. So, most people on Twitter, most registered users have very few followers. Most of the tweets never go anywhere, yet they're spewing out all sorts of stuff. But how does it connect together? So I think the ambient forces us to think through the public and private differently, because it's at a different register. I think that's the thing. So online, the public and private aren't distinct spaces, yet yet we tend to want to read off these things in terms of these categories.
I suppose also it comes back to, you mentioned kind of the idea of ambient affiliation, so this idea of the imagined community, the imagined audience rather. And when those spikes happen, a lot of the time it's because the imagined audience turns out to be different. So we have these kind of circles. This is the imagined audience that I'm imagining that I'm speaking to. There's this other larger audience, which and so the thinking about it in terms of ambient, it kind of as you say, moves through different registers and stuff. But then it stops being ambient at that point, where it gets picked up by an audience member that you were not anticipating, and then that blows up, either because of their particular social capital or network capital, because they are particularly popular, or because they're particularly followed, or so on and so forth. So I suppose another way of thinking about it is, I often think about the public and private as being positioned in relation to the individual, but actually another way might be to flip it and think about the audience, and in what ways do we think about public and private audiences, and what ways actually does Twitter provide us with an imagined audience, imagined private audience, and then this background where actually there's an ambient audience that's receiving that ambient racism and the ways in which that resonates with them or not?
I mean, Tim, your question is a good one, because when I'm working, I'm still sort of working on aspects of this. I've looked up literature around public and private in relation, and there really isn't that much useful work. So it's kind of trying to do it here, but it's still kind of.
Yes, because I mean, where I think public and private is going is usually the whole identity literature and kind of social relations literature and social media, which often doesn't bring out a kind of public-private dimension, which I thought was really interesting what you say, because I think that's kind of key in understanding social media, is that it's producing multiple different kinds of publics and privates. But we're often trying to, and a lot of the outrage literature is often trying to understand them in a kind of old, non-digitized form of public and private.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to, one thing that struck us at the start is who's the audience people are tweeting to? It's a very difficult question to answer in a straightforward, probably private way.
I was wondering about how local or global these tweets might be as well. Again, thinking about your example of the cat and the watermelon and how there's a kind of Americanness to that sort of racism, and how far these tweets are kind of locally racist in some ways, or I don't know if that's something that had really been dealt with in your research.
Yeah, you can collect geolocation data from the search API, even though some people turn it off. Even though it's slightly easier these days, people tend to tweet on their phones and don't sort of leave the default settings. It's fairly, from what we could tell, from when we kind of qualitatively looked at data set, it's a fairly American data set. So there is a kind of skewing of even how to understand these tweets, and maybe even the notion of the public and private. So it's something I didn't really mention, but it's worth obviously contextualizing that. How local it is. I mean, another aspect of this, is this a purely kind of white racism? Are people of different ethnicities also participating in a kind of not racist discourse? Obviously that's different implications. I wouldn't label that as simply as racist statement. So there's lots of, we could become more granular in terms of trying to interpret how racism denial works, both in relation to kind of geolocation as well as the kind of participants. Now, to go down the game of trying to identify participants' ethnic backgrounds is a very flawed activity. I mean, I've blurred out the faces and actually modified the tweets just in terms of ethics and privacy, even though part of me just says let's expose them. But yeah, so I mean, there is research that actually tries to categorize tweeters by their ethnicity by looking at profile pictures, which I find quite problematic.
Can I add on to that as well? Because I had a similar question. Because when you're using Bonnie Silver, right, she's talking about a particular development of a culture of anti-racism that means that racism must be denied, certain forms of racism. And I think she's talking about the UK, right? Is she in that? Or the US?
America.
Oh, US. So you could say it in the UK as well, but there's a specific history of forms of racism that become unacceptable because of anti-racism. And in the kind of normal sense of the way that's understood, that's a way of denying other forms of racism that are still very much alive and well. It shows the history of the progression of cultures of racism, if you like. But so you can understand that in a different context. You can understand that in the US as well. So that when that goes on to Twitter and in some sense it's become decontextualized, and what you're saying, what is the culture of racism that we're talking about, and how do we talk about that?
The idea of the web, it's not a good route to go down to say it has no geopolitical function and the differences, in terms of access, in terms of how different platforms seem more common in some countries more than others, in terms of users, in terms of languages used. So, this is just in English. There's all sorts of stuff going on I don't know about in other languages. So, on one hand, if you really, really wanted to do proper work in this, we'd have to take account all those sorts of differentials. Having said that, the web also breaches borders and boundaries and locations and the way things get picked up, the way things can become viral. So I think it's about one in terms of partly deciding at the start what are you looking at, what phenomena are you looking at, and deciding how significant are boundaries, is geolocation going to be in terms of trying to make sense of the data, rather than trying to deciding a priori, I'm going to do this. So it's a bit of a kind of pragmatic kind of approach, because the web's too complicated just to decide in advance, I'm going to do it in this way. I think you have to look at what problem are you looking at, and what then do I need to do. And it's still we're still in our infancy in terms of trying to research the web. And I was saying to you just earlier before, and what's happening is it's kind of being taken over by data scientists who are crunching very large data sets, producing really nice visuals, and kind of not really able to make sense of it. I've talked to some of these people and they say, yeah, it's not a problem collecting the data, but to make sense of it, we don't have a clue. So I kind of study partly funding, but also we wanted it relatively small scale, because I think if you go really big too quickly, you run into all sorts of issues about how to actually make sense of huge data sets. Not to say that research hasn't got value, but I think we've got to be careful that it's a bit like the old qualitative debates. It's kind of almost reappearing, and qualitative researchers who want to work on the net, even though there's new methods of digital ethnography, are kind of getting left behind with all the monies going to data scientists, because they work in teams, as I was saying, because they have to do large scale work.
Been following a PhD student who's been looking at hashtags, Twitter as the narrative in the first year of Occupy, and so she constantly bounces between reading the tweets to try and get a semantic sense of what's being said, and trying to extract from that ways in which you can then interrogate a database of nearly a million kind of tweets and organise, because she's only selected certain hashtags which they've archived. And so it's become a real kind of problem, because she is situated generally somewhere between qualitative and quantitative, but it's an enormous struggle, because I've come talk to her, she's just spent a day reading 10,000 tweets or something, driven her half mad, because it's a semantic desert, there's not much. But she needs that context to be able somehow to construct meaningful measures she can then quantify.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. I was just thinking that having done this with £10,000, I hope that your funders are very happy with what you've done. It's really impressive. And just having, I think for many of us, there are already questions and we see directions in which to go with this and all that. And I was just wondering, what are for you the kind of most pertinent questions that this raises for your future research and for the stuff that you're trying to get out of it?
I mean, my background is kind of cultural studies, kind of looking at race representation, looking at film and other forms. I've moved into social media because I kind of think it's an interesting space, and the work around race is fairly underdeveloped. There's some really good work out there, but there's not that much of it, and particularly that issue of kind of big data emerging and that kind of analysis. I think it's really important to think about things more conceptually. So in this project, most of the £10,000 was given to the guy Phil, who basically who collected the stuff, did all the technical back-end stuff, and helped produce some of the visualizations, and helped me interpret them. But interpreting them was really hard, because we didn't really have any frameworks to think about. So I had to sort of think these through. And even when I looked at other existing work on race and online culture racism, there isn't that much around that I could really use. So I've turned to the idea of assemblages as a way in, because I did some other work on Black Twitter before. So I think there's an area we need to develop, and that's not just for race. I think it's just generally that the speed of social media is changing all the time. We tend to be playing catch up with it. So there's that difficulty as well. And that's partly why the data scientists are kind of winning, because they can keep collecting the data and saying stuff, but we just, by the time we collect it and think about it, a year's gone or something. So yeah, for me it's trying to think of things a bit more conceptually around race and the digital. I think there's a lot of work to be done. It's just really starting.
So with the hashtag, so you're talking about it as kind of building a, that it builds a kind of, there's a kind of ambience because of the hashtag. But you didn't really say about how the hashtag works to kind of create that. Like it works in some ways because you can search hashtags, you can follow hashtags, there is a network there, but lots of people don't use hashtags in that way, right? They just use it as a way of categorising what they've said. So that goes back to your original point, are these just kind of individual tweets that aren't related? Or if they're related, how are they related actually through the hashtag?
Yeah, I mean that's in some ways that's the sort of challenge of thinking about it into the long tail, because these are kind of relatively isolated events. You know, these are relatively isolated tweets. Most of the people who tweet them don't have a huge amount of followers, so what's the significance of it? The idea of the ambient, in a way, tries to capture the significance only in its cumulative effect. So even though two people might not be following each other or have never interacted, but they use the hashtag not racist, it kind of adds something. It adds something, it adds something, it adds something. But it's kind of invisible. It's a bit like how do you identify ambient music? It's like you can't actually put your finger on it, but it's there, it's an atmosphere. So that's what I'm trying to get at. I did actually preface what I said by that's the key thing I'm trying to work on. Trying to think through what is the ambience if people are using hashtags and they're not knowingly using it. I mean, in this case, I think they're drawing on the more common notion of I'm not racist, which it circulates in broader offline sort of cultures, and have concatenated it into something short to saying I'm not racist. They might have not done it. They might have done it spontaneously in different contexts. They might have never ever seen another tweet with not racist. I'm not sure, but it's trying to capture that very issue of how it works. I mean, a more concrete thing would think about what might an ambient kind of racism be, is what's called, I don't necessarily like the term, the idea of the microaggressions, small statements that are hard to put your finger on that are racist, but they are racist. And I think, and again, it's a bit like how do forms of structural racism reproduce itself, the relationship between individual events and the cumulative effects of that. And one way is to think about assemblies, I guess, because that breaks down the kind of individual structure, kind of dichotomy.
There just is something really strange though about putting it as a hashtag, right? That statement, not racist, is such a racist kind of, or could itself be thought as a microaggression. And the way in which it so it's almost, there's like a stickiness to it, about the way in which these tiny little things, this ambient kind of collects together through that particular hashtag, and what the motivation is for. I'm really struggling to understand why someone, I say, feels the need to put not racist. I guess I get that, but in using a hashtag, which is the predominant kind of searchable semantic language, it's the language of Twitter, that they actually then get bundled up with a load of stuff that they may also consider to be racist. It's a really strange pot to put yourself in.
Yeah, I mean, in that way, the fact that it's a hashtag then sort of takes us back to thinking about Twitter as an assemblage, or its kind of affordances, the fact that people articulate that or form that as a hashtag. I think I like the idea of the stickiness, because it reminds me of Aaron Saldan's work around racism, using Deleuze and Guattari, how, say, whiteness can reproduce itself through its stickiness, that things stick with whiteness, hence it gains its kind of power. We could maybe think about not racist in that way.